Hello and welcome to this lecture series on the New South and the Wild West. This is part 1, Lincoln Reconstruction. In the aftermath of the Civil War, two fundamental questions had been answered. The first was, what is going to be the fate of slavery in the United States? And the beginning of the answer to that question was the Emancipation Proclamation, when Lincoln declared all slaves in rebelling territory free. Didn't free any slaves, but it started the process that ultimately leads to the 13th Amendment, right? The second question that was answered is, can states secede from the Union, right? That had been threatened since the nation's founding. And now this question was fundamentally answered because Lincoln had said no, right? And he was willing to go to war to make sure that the nation was put back together. However, when the war ended, that left two new fundamental questions that needed to be answered. The first question is, what is the status of the rebelling states and how will they be readmitted into the Union, right? The second question that needed to be answered was, what is the status of the former slaves and what is their role that they're going to play in this new post-war America, right? Now, the period that we're going to look at that kind of addresses these questions is the period between 1865 and 1877, which is often referred to as the Reconstruction years. When we take a look at Reconstruction, there's four major groups at play here. One of them are the former slaves themselves, and they really don't have a lot of voice in these early stages of Reconstruction, even when it comes to question number 2, what's going to be the role of African Americans. Though this is the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, so you are going to start seeing some of their voices being heard, people like Frederick Douglass and others, right? The other three groups, the ones that will play major factors in this, are the moderates, the radicals, and the conservatives. Now, when we take a look at Abraham Lincoln, he would be considered a moderate, right? When it comes to the answer to question 1, Abraham Lincoln wants the nation back together as soon as possible. So he, like other moderates, want a fast reunification. What he comes up with as a result of this in December of 1863 is what will be called the 10% plan. He pretty much voiced back in 1863, he says, once the Civil War is over, if you can get 10% of the registered voters in the South to sign a loyalty oath to the Union, then that state can start the process for readmittance into the Union, right? Also part of the 10% plan stated that only high-ranking members of the Confederacy and the government and the military will be excluded from a blanket amnesty that will be granted to everyone else once that 10% requirement had been met. So in other words, if you're a former member of the Confederate government or a high-ranking officer in the Confederate military, you're not going to be able to be involved in the new political system once the state was readmitted. Now, that's the moderate position, fast reunification, right? As far as answering the second question, the role of African Americans, I'll handle that one separately because it does push for some rights for them as well. The radicals, though, thought this plan was absolutely ridiculous. Radicals like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner were men who felt that no, the South needs to be punished when it comes to answering question number 1. They need to pay for the fact that they caused a civil war, that they are responsible for the deaths of over 600,000 Americans, right? And so this 10% plan to them is absolutely ridiculous, right? So what they are going to ascribe to is more punitive measures, measures like what William Tecumseh Sherman did as he marched through the Carolinas. General William Tecumseh Sherman, as he marched from Georgia up through South Carolina into North Carolina, issued an order called Special Field Order Number 15. If you ever heard that term 40 acres and a mule, this is the 40 acres part of it. Basically what he said was that all captured slave-holding lands are to be reallocated in 40-acre plots to the freed slaves. So they are given 40 acres from the former slave master's land in which to use however they wish, right? That was the radicals' idea of how to answer the first question. As far as answering the second question, they believed that, well, African Americans should be given not only the end of slavery, but full citizenship and including full suffrage, the right to vote, right? Now, the third group was the conservatives, right, which was a compromise group, mostly of some Northerners and mostly Southern whites, who felt that, well, like the moderates, the southern states should be allowed to rejoin the Union quickly, but as far as the freedmen goes, hey, their freedom was good enough. They need to be satisfied with what they got, right? They have their freedom and that's it. Now, the radicals are going to put pressure on Abraham Lincoln. They hate this moderate plan. Matter of fact, they're even going to go so far as to pass a bill called the Wade-Davis Bill. The Wade-Davis Bill called for an appointment of provisional governors in each of the former Confederate states, right? And it called for a loyalty oath that required 50% of registered voters in the South to sign it before the process of readmission into the Union can begin. And finally, it stated that Southern members of the government and anyone else who ever bore arms against the United States is excluded from participating in the new government. So if you so much as threw a rock at a Union soldier, you can never participate in the government unless, of course, you get a pardon from the President of the United States. Right? Congress is going to approve this Wade-Davis bill in late 1864. Right? Abraham Lincoln, though, did away with it by not signing it. He did what was called a pocket veto. He allowed it to expire while he was away, and this gave him the ability to say, hey, look, I just never signed it. I never got around to it. I didn't veto it, technically. Now, as far as the answer to question number 2 for Lincoln and the moderates, what is going to be the role of African Americans in this post-Civil War era? Lincoln pushed through and got created the Freedmen's Bureau. Its full name is actually the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Land. It was established in March of 1865, 1 month before Lincoln's death. It was placed under the United States Army under General Oliver Otis Howard. And the Freedmen's Bureau was designed to do a lot of things to help these former slaves in the South, these freedmen, as they were now called. It was designed to bring relief to the South. Remember, the South was pretty war ravaged because most of the fighting took place down there, right? It was to adjudicate disputes between employers and now these new freedmen who were looking for gainful employment because they were no longer slaves, right? They issued rations not only to former slaves and freedmen, but also to poor whites in the South. And they also began a lot of new construction, began building schools for African Americans in the South, and they also began building churches. African Americans prior to the end of the Civil War often would have to go to their master's church, right? Now they start building black churches that are going to play a role as we move forward in the civil rights movement, right? Now, this is Lincoln and the moderates' answer to question number 2. The 10% plan is his answer to question number 1. But ultimately, the moderates are not going to carry the day on how Reconstruction will go forward. Matter of fact, when we talk about presidential Reconstruction, we're not really talking about Lincoln Reconstruction because it never really takes place. Why? Well, because Lincoln got dead, right? Because John Wilkes Booth happened. On the evening of April 14th, 1865, at the Ford Theater, John Wilkes Booth shot President Lincoln in the back of the head, and he died on the early morning hours of April 15th. At that point, his vice president, Tennessee Democrat Andrew Johnson, is going to take over Reconstruction. And so when we talk about presidential Reconstruction, we're really talking mostly about Johnson Reconstruction.